Okay, good morning. I'm going to continue with the chapter 1 of the Do Ask, Do Tell, A Gay Conservative Lashes Back book, the slideshow, or I call it the show. And just to let you know, that's that book. And I'm also going to refer to the third book, Do Ask, Do Tell, Speeches in a Fundamental Right, Being Listened to as a Privilege, when I talk about my experience at NIH. So let's have at it and go back to this picture of an apartment building in Arlington, Virginia on Glebe Road, just south of Route 50. That's where I saw my first therapist starting in December of 1961 and going on through June or July of 1962. On the second floor, there were a lot of professional offices, and that's where I saw Dr. Benham for once a week for about 6 months, and my parents paid for $25 or I think it was $20 a visit, something like that then. Just to recap a couple of things. First of all, I was going to be starting at GW. The tuition was $400 a semester. And it would be $800 a semester when I graduated in 1965. I thought I'd mention that. In December of 61, Michael did pay a visit, and I told him what had happened. He looked good. He would have had to go through hazing at VPI, or Virginia Tech. Now it's Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, but then it was VPI, Virginia Polytechnic Institute. And there was no evidence that anything had happened to him that would have distracted me. That's something I mentioned to the therapist, and that's going to come up at NIH pretty soon. But that kind of led to a comment that the therapist talked to my parents, and in those days he could, because the idea was to get approved to go back to William and Mary, which the therapist pretty soon said no, he wasn't going to be able to do that. I was going to be seeing a psychiatrist for a couple of years, not just a couple of weeks. And anyway, the therapist passed on the idea that I don't see people as people, which means normally that I talk about them in a pedantic way from above, as if I didn't have to have anything to do with them and didn't feel their emotions, or wasn't in solidarity with them or something. That's one interpretation. And David Hogg in his book, Never Again, mentions that on page 54, the idea of seeing people as people. And he wrote that when he was a senior in high school. I thought that was remarkable that a teenager could even say that. Of being at someone's level and not thinking you're above them. Or it could mean this fetish I had about what I was attracted to. That might be more likely what he meant. The other thing, I kind of wanted to mention a couple of other things too. When we were leaving the dorm at William and Mary, my father pointed to the mattress on the lower bedroom. We had to carry it downstairs for some reason. I don't know why. It was actually in the staircase, just like in Vertigo. He said, "This is why you aren't a homosexual." And he pointed to some evidence of the deposit, seminal deposit. Well, he didn't think that homosexuals had wet dreams, which is another, old wives' tale from the past, but that was kind of a shocking thing. And the other thing is that music had played into this. My roommate, even though he was going to major in theater and wanted to become a theater actor, he couldn't stand some things in classical music. And one time he really had a cow when the Second Symphony of Brahms, that very leisurely first movement theme, played on the radio. And he said that some people didn't want to have classical music stations in his hometown, which is Roanoke, because they didn't want to have to listen to it even for a second when the dial passed the station, or did it in your car, for example. But so Brahms' Second Symphony had some notoriety, as well as the other records we listened to that we talked about in the last session with my friendship with John. Also, John actually came to visit me at the end of January before I started school at GW, which is the spring semester was in February. And he stayed 3 or 4 days, and he gave me some records from his collection in California. And he said that he played my little sonatina that I had composed at 13. And from memory, and he thought that scale, when I played the scale theme, that this thing, that told him I was gay. Somehow, only a gay person would have written a theme like that. I thought that was very strange. And I was also told I had a habit of putting my hands on boys' knees, and it's true. One time I did that with him. We slept in the same room, in the twin beds in my bedroom, which is another thing. My bedroom had twin beds, and it was only normally used by me. And yet my parents were talking in 4th grade about adopting a sister, so I'd have a sibling, and they dropped it. But where would they have put her? They wouldn't have been in the same room. They'd have had to remodel the house. I remember that back in maybe 1954, 1952, or it was shortly after I started taking piano. But anyway, as the spring went on, the therapist came up with the idea that I ought to be a patient in NIH, where they were doing a study of college students who had been forced to leave school. And this was when there was a lot of emphasis on defense, and the Cold War and everything was heating up. And so they were very concerned that people were having trouble in college, and people were having trouble adapting to being away from home the first time and so forth. And so this is the clinical center at NIH. And I was a patient from July 62 till January 63, when we just simply decided to leave, and I found out she could leave, and here's another view of the clinical center from a different angle. I think that picture dates back to 2004. The building was built in the 50s, and yet it looks very modern. How it looks like it's brand new. It still does. It was, when you got there, this is a drawing. Obviously I can't make a photo of the inside. I can't go there and take a photo of Unit 3 West now, but you would enter here from the elevator, and there was a solarium which looked outside over the lawn towards Wisconsin Avenue. And there would be some patient rooms, but there would be interview rooms here. And then there was a one-way mirror where the interviews that could be observed with the therapist. And I had therapy three mornings a week. And then there was a day room here, and there was a dining area, and there was a nurse's station. And then there were more rooms, and I stayed in the last room, which didn't have any windows because it had been intended for the more difficult patients, which tells you something. But it just, they didn't have any more room. And I had a roommate who was very into classical music and into literature, and I don't really know what his problem was. Some of the men seemed to be pretty intact, and I made friends with a couple of them. And then the women seemed to be much less intact than the men, because they had been chosen differently for different problems, probably. And then over here was the John and so forth. And over time, well, one of the things I had to give up, I had to surrender my patent medicines. You couldn't have any nasal spray or Rolaids or anything like that there. When I caught a cold, it was really uncomfortable. But over time, in the therapy, my parents came once a week for family therapy and family art therapy, where we drew in front of each other. And my father was very uneasy about that. Oh, I should also mention, going back just a little bit. My father had a heart attack in February of 1962, when he was down in Williamsburg, actually talking to the dean if there was still some way I could return and how I would get credit for if I ever did return. And then he was in a garage and he had a lot of indigestion and he drove home. And then the doctor told him, well, you've given up, you smoked your last cigarette. I mean, we used to give cigarettes, cartons for Christmas presents, and not anymore. You know, that's how it was then. And he was in the hospital and he was mild. He came home pretty soon, but the loud music from the basement, from my classical music, was a problem. But I did continue composing, and that's when I composed the slow movement of the sonata, and there was a theme of lamentation. Sort of like that, in F sharp minor. But anyway, this had an effect on him, my expulsion and the strain on the marriage, and probably what it was like that weekend in Charlotte for my parents not knowing what was going on, you know, and what this was like for Mother too, you know, in the last session. This had a strain on them. So the family art therapy, my father really got very nervous and he started developing a nervous stomach and having what they call irritable bowel, and having to go to see a psychiatrist himself. So you can see the medication mill going on even then in 1962, that the psychiatric profession had a racket. I'm going to read a passage from page 65 of the third book. When what NIH wrote in 1962 in his patient notes in my records is indeed telling. The homosexual fantasies are a prime preoccupation with him because a great part of his satisfaction feeling for other people is based on the nature of these fantasies. He's constantly preoccupied with the masculine qualities of his contemporaries. This is particularly focused on the amount, color, and distribution of hair about the wrists of the young men. The secondary sexual characteristic is indeed the nature of a part object having considerable erotic and symbolic significance to him, concerned not only with the quality of the hair on the wrist, but of its durability and the possibility of losing it, like in an accident or war or something. He becomes sexually aroused in the presence of young men who have these characteristics or in thinking about these characteristics. This gets to be elaborated to include both the accomplishments of and the moral character of his contemporaries. He questions and wonders and puts under constant scrutiny these contemporaries to see if they come up to his standard for the ideal man. Again, this fascination or fantasy was possible because in those days you didn't talk about male attractiveness unless the case with some birds in nature, beauty was the prerogative of passive females. That's how it was. It was the women who got the attention for being beautiful. Men could be ugly. Remember how it was? And when they got married, they tended to put on weight, you know, and got even uglier. That was the convention. And so your mind could make more of it and believe that in time others would have to as well. So I just thought I would share that passage. And that meant that's the people as not seeing people as people thing, and not coming off my high horse and being willing to join others as part of a group. During the fall, you know, I wanted, you know, again, a want was the record collection. Even though I wasn't financially independent yet, I wanted to build it up. And John had given me some records when he came, but my parents let me have a stereo in October, and this was the first stereo I had, which the record's track cover. That's a Voice of Music, and those are the two speakers. That was in the basement. You see the paneling that your father's friend had put in 1950, and the Smiths. Remember, I talked about from Charlotte. And then here's some patient notes. I just read them to you, and some exams at GW. And then in 1963, even though I was going to school full-time again, I started working. I finally took a full-time job as a lab tech in the rheology lab at the National Bureau of Standards, which was on the Federal City College property on Van Ness and Connecticut Avenue. Now it's the University District of Columbia that has these balls that look like they come from a Magic, a Clive Barker's novel. I forget what they're called, but that's the UDC compass. And then it moved to Gaithersburg. There were ducks on the lawn of their property in Gaithersburg. I drove out there one time just to see what it looked like, and that's the entrance to the National Bureau of Standards today. I'll come back to chess in just a minute, but that's when I went to have the medical clearance. I had to have to pass a physical to get the job, and the doctor's name was Pincock, ironically. And I did mention the psychiatric history, and he demanded to know the nature of the history. And of course, my parents had said I must never mention homosexuality again. And so I called my father to ask him from the office if it was all right to mention it, and he said yes. And the doctor approved me despite having admitted latent homosexuality in the past. Now, this was 1963, in August of 1963. Maybe things were just starting to get a little better by then. It was slowly changing, even well before Stonewall, that people knew there was something wrong with the degree of discrimination that was kind of irrational. I would also mention that excuse. It's hard to talk a long time. You need water when you're talking a long time. So just got some. That I had another summer job starting in 1965 in Carteret, Maryland, at the David Taylor Model Basin, where I learned computer programming and Fortran for the first time. So I thought I would mention that. But the last thing kind of to mention is that I started getting better at my life when I started taking up chess. I joined the GWU chess club that met on Friday afternoons in the top floor of the library. And I improved very quickly, getting to where I could beat players that had been much stronger than me. In 3 or 4 months, people that I lost to all the time, I was beating maybe half of the time. And I improved very quickly, and then started playing in tournaments with USCF. And my first rating was in the 1500s, I think. And then I rose. The highest rating I ever got was close to 2,000 later on. But the playing chess seemed to be very good for my mental health. But one of the other guys who I improved against and got to where I could beat him about half the time, was so preoccupied with chess that he started skipping his classes at GW and wound up flunking out and wound up getting drafted, not finishing school. So it wasn't good for him. So that's kind of how I settled down and finally got my degree. And then the next episode will deal with my graduate school and military service. So thank you, and thank you again for listening today. And we'll see you for the next episode soon.